Rome's collapse wasn't a single moment. It was a long, drawn-out tragedy worthy of a stage play. Once the unshakable center of the world, the empire had become hollow, a shadow of its former self. Senators still wore togas, emperors still sat on thrones, but behind the marble walls, rot spread. Corruption gnawed at the core. Bribes became the true currency of power. Loyalty was bought and sold like grain. Generals plotted against emperors. Emperors betrayed their own soldiers, and entire legions were more devoted to gold than to Rome itself. The empire wasn't just attacked from outside, it was being eaten alive from within. Barbarian armies gathered at the borders, Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths, yet the great irony was that many had once been allies. Some had even served as mercenaries in Roman legions, fighting under the same eagle standards they would later burn. Betrayals cut both ways. Rome often promised land or citizenship to these tribes, only to break its word. Resentment festered until swords were drawn. Then came the shocking blows. In 410 CE, the Visigoth king Alaric led his forces into Rome itself. The Eternal City, untouched for 800 years, was plundered. Citizens wept in the streets as sacred temples and noble villas were looted. In 455 CE, the Vandals struck again, this time so ruthlessly that their name became forever linked to wanton destruction. Meanwhile, in the West, emperors were little more than puppets, often children placed on thrones by scheming generals. The last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was only a boy when he was forced to abdicate in 476 CE. A bitter echo of Rome's founder, Romulus, whose name had once symbolized destiny. The circle had closed. And yet, here lies the twist. Rome did not truly die. Its eastern half, Byzantium, survived, still calling itself Roman for centuries. Its laws, language, and even its dream of empire lingered in fragments across Europe. For the people watching Rome crumble, it was the end of the world. But in truth, it was only the end of one world and the birth of another. The curtain had fallen on Rome, but the Dark Ages had just stepped onto the stage. When Rome finally collapsed, the world expected chaos, and chaos came. But instead of endless ruin, new kings rose from the ashes, crowned not in marble palaces, but in the smoking ruins of empire. These barbarians, once Rome's enemies, suddenly found themselves ruling Rome's lands. But were they really destroyers, or reluctant heirs to the very empire they toppled? The Visigoths struck first. After plundering Rome in 1010 CE, their leader, Alaric, died mysteriously on the road to further conquest. Legend says he was buried with his treasure beneath a riverbed, the waters diverted to hide his grave forever, a secret Rome's enemies and survivors both feared to disturb. His people didn't vanish. Instead, they built a kingdom in Spain, blending Roman laws with Gothic traditions. The destroyers were already becoming rulers. The Vandals followed. Sailing across the Mediterranean, they stormed into North Africa, seizing Carthage, the breadbasket of the empire. Their king, Genseric, wasn't just a raider. He was a master strategist who built a navy so powerful it rivaled Rome's old fleets. From Africa, the Vandals controlled the grain supply and could starve Italy at will. Yet, in their courts, Roman advisors and scribes continued their work, drafting laws and managing cities as though Rome had never fallen. The Ostrogoths added their twist. Under Theodoric the Great, they ruled Italy itself. Though a barbarian king, Theodoric wore Roman robes, quoted Roman law, and kept Roman senators in his service. In many ways, he played emperor better than the Romans themselves had in centuries. His kingdom looked so Roman that citizens often wondered, Had Rome really fallen, or had it simply changed its rulers' accents? But beneath this uneasy blending of cultures, betrayal simmered. Barbarian kings ruled in Rome's shadow, always needing the legitimacy of its culture, its religion, and its symbols. They wore crowns, but never escaped the ghost of Caesar. Some tried to embrace Rome's heritage, others sought to erase it. The line between conqueror and heir blurred until history itself seemed confused. Here lies the twist. The so-called barbarians who toppled Rome also carried it forward. Without them, Roman laws, cities, and even Christianity might have been lost entirely. In destroying Rome, they accidentally preserved its soul. The world thought Rome had ended, but through its conquerors, Rome still whispered, just in a new voice. As emperors fell and generals betrayed one another, a new force quietly stepped into the vacuum, the Christian Church. It had once been persecuted by Rome, its followers thrown to lions in arenas. Now, in the chaos of collapse, it became the only institution that seemed unshakable, draped in crosses while kings and empires crumbled. Bishops replaced generals. While warlords fought over ruins, bishops settled disputes, fed the hungry, and declared the will of God over the will of kings. People no longer looked to emperors for stability, they turned to priests and monasteries. In villages and cities alike, the church became both savior and judge. But power always comes with shadows. Knowledge was preserved, but controlled. Monks meticulously copied sacred texts and even Roman philosophy by candlelight. Yet not all books were shared. Certain works were locked away, considered too dangerous or pagan for common eyes. The church decided which truths survived the Dark Ages and which were silenced. Faith became law. Pagan temples were destroyed or repurposed as churches. Old Roman gods were branded as demons. What had once been pluralistic became strictly ruled by one truth, and questioning it was dangerous. Politics and piety entwined. Popes and bishops crowned kings, blessed battles, and in return received lands and wealth. Some rulers claimed divine right not because of bloodlines, but because the church declared it so. Behind the altar, whispers spread of hidden agendas. Was the church protecting civilization or keeping it on a leash? To some, it was the last guardian of Rome's greatness. To others, it was the most cunning usurper of them all, seizing power without swords. The twist: Rome may have fallen politically, but spiritually, it had been reborn. The church was in many ways a second Rome, an empire not of legions, but of faith, crossing borders and commanding loyalty from peasants to kings. Unlike Rome, it couldn't be toppled by invaders because it lived in the hearts and minds of the people. The irony was sharp. The institution once crushed under Roman persecution now ruled the very lands Rome had lost. The cross had replaced the eagle, and in its shadow, Europe would bow for centuries. When Rome's marble roads cracked and its aqueducts dried, it wasn't emperors or generals who suffered most, it was the ordinary people. For peasants and villagers, the fall of Rome didn't feel like politics. It felt like hunger, disease, and fear, pressing down on every corner of life. Daily survival was a battlefield. Fields once rich with Roman engineering now relied on the back-breaking labor of peasants tied to the land. Droughts could mean starvation. A single bad harvest could wipe out whole communities. Bandits and raiders roamed the countryside, and with no Roman legions to keep order, villagers often built crude wooden walls or fled to fortified manors, seeking protection from local lords. The plague struck like divine wrath. After Rome's fall, waves of disease swept across Europe. Entire villages were abandoned overnight. To the survivors, plagues were not medical mysteries, but punishments from heaven or curses whispered by witches. The fear was so deep that families sometimes abandoned their sick to die alone, believing even compassion might invite contamination. Superstition ruled where knowledge had withered. Without Rome's libraries open and its schools functioning, folk beliefs and rumors became the law of life. A comet in the night sky was not a natural event, but a prophecy of doom. A stillbirth wasn't seen as tragedy alone, it was evidence of sin or sorcery. Cures came not from doctors, but from charms, prayers, or the local wise woman, who herself could become a target if things went wrong. Fear forged the feudal world. Peasants, terrified of raiders and divine punishment, submitted to powerful lords who offered protection in exchange for labor and loyalty. Castles rose not as symbols of glory, but as cages of safety, stone sanctuaries in a land of uncertainty. Life was lived under the shadow of both sword and cross. And yet, even here in the bleakest shadows, sparks of resilience burned. Families clung to traditions, festivals, and faith as fragile lifelines. Songs and stories carried hope from one generation to the next. The people did not live in silence, they endured, stubbornly shaping the roots of future Europe. The twist? To history, this age looks like endless misery, but within these struggles, new ways of life, feudal bonds, local communities, and folk wisdom were being forged. While emperors vanished, peasants built the foundations of a society that would outlast kings. The rulers may have fought for power, but the Dark Ages truly belonged to those who survived in the shadows. While warlords fought for land and peasants struggled to survive, a quieter battle was being waged in the flicker of candlelight, the battle to preserve knowledge. In isolated monasteries perched on windswept cliffs or tucked deep in valleys, monks became the unlikely guardians of civilization. By day, they farmed and prayed. By night, they hunched over parchment, their quills scratching out the words of ancient Rome and Greece, Cicero, Aristotle, Virgil, texts that might have vanished forever had their hands not preserved them. But not all knowledge was equal. A dangerous choice was made. Some manuscripts were carefully copied and shared within the church. Others were deliberately locked away, deemed heretical or pagan. There are whispers that entire scrolls were burned, not because they lacked value, but because their ideas clashed with doctrine. The monasteries became vaults of power. Literacy itself was rare. Most peasants couldn't read, and even kings often relied on clerics to interpret documents. Those who controlled the books controlled the truth. Knowledge became a weapon, wielded in secret by men of the cloth. And within those hidden shelves lay forbidden secrets, ancient medical treatises that suggested healing without prayer, astronomical charts mapping the skies, hinting at a universe far larger and stranger than the church wished to admit. Pagan myths woven with philosophy that challenged the very order of heaven and earth. Legends spread that some monks, overcome by curiosity, secretly studied these banned texts, risking accusations of heresy. Some were caught and silenced. Others vanished, their fate never known. The paradox was sharp. The Dark Ages looked ignorant from the outside, but beneath the cloisters, a quiet war of knowledge raged. Civilization wasn't lost, it was hidden, guarded, and censored at the same time. The twist? While kings spilled blood for crowns, the real inheritance of Rome, the wisdom of centuries, was trapped in ink and parchment, locked behind monastery doors. And those who held the keys weren't always interested in sharing them with the world. If peasants lived in fear and monks in silence, the warlords and kings lived in fire. The fall of Rome left behind not one empire, but 1,000 thrones, each claimed by men hungry for crowns. Europe became a chessboard of power. In Italy, rival dukes fought over the ruins of Rome, each proclaiming themselves the rightful heir. In Gaul, the Franks arose, led by warriors who wore wolf pelts and carried Roman swords looted from the dead. In Britain, petty kings and would-be Arthurs squabbled endlessly, crowning themselves kings of lands barely larger than a village. But bloodlines weren't enough to keep power. Oaths were broken as quickly as they were sworn. A warlord might pledge loyalty to his overlord in the morning, only to betray him by nightfall, when a rival offered more gold. Alliances were sealed not with treaties, but with marriages, and those marriages were often poisoned by adultery, ambition, or assassination. Brothers killed brothers, sons rebelled against fathers, and queens sometimes played the deadliest game of all, choosing which man to crown with their support. The church watched and manipulated. Bishops crowned kings with holy oil, giving wars the appearance of divine justice. But behind the ceremonies, popes whispered promises to one ruler while secretly blessing another. In a world without Rome's order, politics became theater, and betrayal was the main act. The battlefield itself was raw and brutal. Forget the disciplined Roman legions. Armies of the Dark Ages were ragged mobs of spearmen, horsemen, and desperate peasants armed with whatever tools they had. Wars were less about strategy and more about fury, ambition, and survival. When cities fell, they weren't absorbed. They were burned, their people slaughtered or enslaved. The twist? The endless fighting didn't just tear kingdoms apart, it reshaped them. Out of the chaos rose new powers, the foundations of France, England, and Germany. What looked like mindless destruction was in fact the birth pangs of modern Europe, born through treachery, ambition, and rivers of blood. Just when Europe thought it couldn't sink deeper into chaos, the seas themselves roared with a new terror, the Vikings. To the monks who first recorded their raids, they were not men, but demons from the sea, wild-haired giants with axes that could split shields in two, and longships that moved like ghosts across the water. The terror began suddenly. In 793 CE, the monastery of Lindisfarne in England was attacked. Monks were slaughtered, sacred relics stolen, and the survivors whispered that God's wrath had taken human form. From that moment, the very sight of a dragon-headed ship on the horizon froze entire villages in fear. Their fury was unmatched. Vikings struck like lightning, raiding monasteries, towns, and villages before defenders could gather. They showed no mercy, burning churches, enslaving survivors, and carrying away treasures that had been hidden for centuries. Even mighty kings trembled, for Viking warbands didn't care for borders, laws, or treaties. They came for plunder and blood. But the Vikings were not only destroyers, they were also builders, traders, and explorers. They carved trade routes from Scandinavia down to Constantinople, bringing furs, amber, and slaves in exchange for silver and silk. They settled lands, Normandy in France, Dublin in Ireland, Kiev in Eastern Europe, leaving behind cities, dynasties, and cultures that would shape nations. Their myths, gods, and sagas seeped into European imagination, turning Odin, Thor, and Loki into echoes that would last long after the raids ended. The church spun their own tale. Clerics called the Vikings God's punishment for Europe's sins, feeding fear and obedience. Yet some rulers secretly allied with them, using Viking muscle to crush rivals. The twist, what began as a storm of fire, eventually became a wind of change. The same Vikings who burned monasteries would one day kneel at altars, baptized into the faith they once tried to destroy. Their descendants became kings, dukes, and even emperors. The demons of the sea turned into lords of the land, reshaping Europe not through terror alone, but through legacy. After centuries of warlords, plagues, and Viking raids, Europe seemed trapped in endless darkness. And yet, in the late 8th century, a new figure rose who dared to dream of something greater. Charlemagne, King of the Franks. To his allies, he was Charles the Great. To his enemies, he was a thunderbolt in human form. His vision was radical. Instead of ruling like a mere warlord, Charlemagne sought to rebuild what Rome had lost. He forged an empire that stretched from modern France to Germany, from Italy to the lowlands, territory unseen since the Caesars. He was crowned by the Pope as Emperor of the Romans on Christmas Day in 800, a title heavy with symbolism. Rome was reborn, not in marble, but in faith and iron. But Charlemagne's true legacy was not only conquest, it was learning. He ordered schools to be built, where boys and, in rare cases, girls, learned to read, write, and count, reviving knowledge that had been crumbling in monasteries. He gathered scholars from across Europe, men like Alcuin of York, who preserved ancient texts and spread new ideas. Latin, once the language of empire, was given new life as the language of education and faith. For a moment, it felt as though the darkness was lifting. Monasteries hummed with the copying of manuscripts, courts sparkled with poetry and philosophy, and kings saw themselves not just as warriors, but as heirs to civilization. Yet, the light was fragile. Charlemagne's empire fractured almost as soon as he died, split between his sons, who bickered and betrayed one another. The Vikings returned in force, testing the fragile peace with fire and steel. Even the church, which had crowned him, began plotting how to use the imperial idea for its own supremacy. Still, the Carolingian Renaissance, as it would later be called, planted seeds of learning, order, and ambition that would sprout centuries later in the great universities and kingdoms of medieval Europe. The twist, Charlemagne's legacy was not a golden age, but a fragile spark, a light that flickered in the storm. It could have been snuffed out at any moment, and yet somehow, against all odds, it endured. After Charlemagne's fragile light, Europe slipped once more into shadows. His empire fractured like broken glass, leaving shards of kingdoms ruled by weak heirs and ambitious rivals. What followed was not one single catastrophe, but an age of grinding, endless struggle. The cycle of famine returned. Crops failed under strange weather. Winters stretched longer, rains drowned fields, summers burned dry. Hunger stalked the countryside, and entire villages starved, their bones buried in shallow graves. Desperation bred cruelty. Parents abandoned children they could not feed. Peasants revolted against lords who hoarded grain, only to be crushed and punished with brutal taxes. The wars never ended. Brothers turned against brothers in civil wars over land and titles. Castles rose like jagged teeth across the landscape, symbols of both protection and oppression. Lords fortified themselves behind stone, while peasants became pawns in their feuds. Raids from the outside world, Vikings from the north, Magyars from the east, Saracens from the south, struck like recurring nightmares, leaving smoking ruins in their wake. Faith became both comfort and chain. Church bells rang out as the one unshakable rhythm of life, calling the starving and broken to prayer. People clung to the promise of heaven because the earth offered little hope. But faith could also deepen the suffering. Heretics were hunted, witches burned, and fear of sin overshadowed daily life. And yet, there was survival. Monks continued their silent work, preserving manuscripts, while outside their abbey walls, swords clashed. Farmers innovated in small ways, heavier plows, water mills, and new field rotations that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to ease the burden of hunger. Songs, stories, and traditions kept the spirit alive. Even in famine, festivals still flickered, a stubborn refusal of ordinary people to surrender their humanity to despair. The twist? Though history calls it a dark age, the people living it were not silent shadows. They endured, adapted, and preserved just enough knowledge, just enough strength to keep civilization alive. The long night was not the end. It was the harsh winter before the spring. After centuries of chaos, famine, and fear, the thousand-year night of post-Roman Europe began to stir with the faint light of morning. It was not sudden. There was no single victory, no grand moment of triumph. Instead, Europe's survival itself became its miracle. Signs of renewal began to emerge. Farming innovations spread, the heavy plow cut deeper into soil, three-field rotation allowed more crops, and mills powered by water and wind multiplied food supplies. For the first time in generations, famine loosened its grip. Villages grew into towns, and towns into trade centers. Markets bustled where only ruins had stood. Coins returned, replacing barter, and merchants stitched together fragile networks of commerce. Castles gave way to cathedrals, towering testaments not just to faith, but to ambition. These stone giants reached for heaven, declaring that Europe was no longer only surviving, but daring to dream. Knowledge resurfaced like buried treasure. The manuscripts copied in secret by monks were now studied in courts and schools. Ancient philosophy, Roman law, and scientific observations began to seep back into daily life. The church still guarded much, but cracks appeared in its monopoly over truth. Seeds of inquiry were planted, seeds that centuries later would bloom into the Renaissance. New powers rose from the ashes. The kingdoms of France, England, and Germany began to solidify. Once wandering tribes had now become nations, forging identities that would dominate the medieval world. Even the once feared Vikings transformed, trading axes for crowns, founding realms like Normandy, and even laying the foundations of Russia. And yet, the dawn was not without shadows. The same cathedrals that inspired awe also demanded crushing taxes from peasants. Trade brought prosperity, but also rivalry, sparking fresh wars. Knowledge stirred questions that the church was not ready to answer. Europe had survived the Dark Ages, but the battles of faith, power, and progress were only beginning. The twist? The end of the Dark Ages was not a clean sunrise, but a fragile dawn streaked with clouds. What lay ahead, the Crusades, the Black Death, the Renaissance, would prove that the story of Europe was not one of smooth progress, but of cycles of light and shadow. The collapse of Rome had not ended civilization. It had forced it to be reborn, battered but unbroken, in forms no one could have foreseen.